Today's daf is daf Eruvin Mem Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated by Heather Stone in memory of her mother, Ellie Stone, Esther Bina Bat Rachel and Avraham Halevi Zichrona Levracha, and by Alana Mushkin in memory of her father, Rav Pinchas Shmuel Lederman Zichrona Levracha, on his 5th yahrzeit on the 8th of Elul. My father was a well-loved Rav, a social activist, and a scholar who completed the Daf Yomi cycle 2.5 times. I learn every morning in his memory, and I'm grateful for Hadram for enabling me to do so. With that, we'll get started. We started with a whole interesting thing yesterday about rules. How do we determine the halacha? If this one argues with this one, then we paskin this way, etc. Then we have Rav Masharshi who said, I don't believe in all these generalizations, these general principles, okay? Where I think his approach is more, or at least we think right now, that it's more specific. It depends on the situation. It depends on, right? There's always different reasons as to why we would determine the halacha being a particular way. Now, the Gemara is going to attempt, and I believe it's 6 attempts. Yeah, there's 6 attempts. You can see them all charted out on the sheet. It even goes to the second side because there's so many. 6 attempts to try to figure out why Rav Masharshia thought that we don't have these rules. Okay, so we started with one yesterday. We're going to bring situations. We're going to see in some of them, we're going to paskin against the person who had said in the rules. And then they're going to say, well, oh, don't you see? It's obviously against the rules. That means there are no rules. To each, we're going to answer as we answered yesterday. When someone says the halacha is like this, then we don't use that principle. But in the absence of somebody saying the halacha is like this, that's when the principle kicks in. And that's going to be the answer to the first 3 attempts. Then we're going to have a bit of a different type, which is going to be, they say the halacha is like the person that the rules already say the halacha is like, so why does he need to tell us this? Isn't it obvious from the rules? And then each time we're going to bring a different answer as to why not. What's interesting about today's daf, there's a number of interesting things. One is that we're going to jump from topic to topic. We're going to start in Tchumen issues, and then they're going to bring other issues outside of the world of Tchumen. And it's just going to be interesting to learn all sorts of different topics. So now we're going to get to the second one. Elamei haditnam, we're 6 lines from the bottom of Mem Vav Amud. Ir shel yachiv v'na'aset shel rabim ma'arvin et kula. Okay, we're out of Tchum, we're into Eruv to be able to carry. If you have a city, if you remember, you can't make an Eruv in a real Reshut HaRabim midoraita. What if it's a Reshut HaRabim by certain criteria, but it doesn't have all the criteria of Reshut HaRabim? Okay, so let's say we have an Ir shel yachiv, we have a city that doesn't have a lot of people in it. And then, but it maybe has some of the criteria of Reshut HaRabim. And then it's Na'aset Shel Rabim. The city all of a sudden has a population explosion. And in the city that maybe doesn't have all the criteria of Reshut HaRabim, but now all of a sudden has 600,000 people in the city. That turns it into a Reshut HaRabim. Well, not exactly. It has certain criteria of Reshut HaRabim. It has a ton of people, but it doesn't have all the criteria. So what do we say? You can still make an Eruv in the city because it's still not of proper Reshut HaRabim, and it started out as a small town. So because of that, we're going to say, Ma'arvin et kula. You can make an Eruv on the whole city, no problem. Again, if it was a real proper Reshut HaRabim, had all the things on the list, like how wide it is and all sorts of other criteria, then you wouldn't be able to. But here we have a case where it's not 100% Reshut HaRabim, but it does have a lot of people. But what if it's the reverse? What if you had a city, Shel Rabim? It used to have 600,000 people living in the city. V'na'aset shel yachid. Okay, it didn't have all, but now what happens? So it was a huge city, and then all of a sudden people started leaving the city. We know this happens, right? There's population shifts, or something happened, there was a plague, and then in the end we have much fewer people. Ein ma'arvin et kula, since it was originally a big city, you can't make an Eruv in the whole city unless you have to do an Eruv like this. You say, right now it's not a proper Reshut HaRabim, but it was once. So since, okay, this is classic, right? Sometimes parents, you look at your kids and you see your kid is a particular way, and it's hard for you to change your approach about, what you think about your kid, even when they've grown up and they don't do it anymore. But once you perceive something in one way, it's very hard to take it out of your mind. So likewise here, once it was a big city, it's very hard to change it 100% to an Ir Shel Yachid, which means, it doesn't mean it belongs to one person. It means it's just less people in the city. So what do? It clearly can't belong to one person. You'll see why. Because it says here, you have to make an Eruv over most of the city, but leave a section with at least 50 people in it that's not part of the Eruv. And then it'll be noticeable that you're not making an Eruv in the entire city. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's approach. Rabbi Shimon Omer, shalosh chatzerot shel shnei batim. All you need to leave is 3 courtyards with 2 houses. You don't need 50 people. That's sufficient. You leave over a little corner front, that's fine. Okay, so that's their machloket. Ba'amar Rav Chamer bar Guria Amarav, halacha ke Rabbi Shimon. Right? He paskins like Rabbi Shimon. Again, it's the same person as before. So he says, we hold like Rabbi Shimon, right? This is all in the name of Rav. Remember that for later. Umam paligale Rabbi Yehuda, who argues with him, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon al-Hake Rabbi Yehuda. And don't we say when Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So how could the fact that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon must prove Rabbi Sharshia's point? That these klalim aren't relevant. But the Gemara says, like they did before, Umay kushya, dilma hachinami, hecha de itmar itmar, hecha de lo itmar lo itmar. It's only when someone paskins the halacha do we not go by the rules. But otherwise, we're going to follow the rules. In other words, yes, there's rules. Once in a while, somebody paskins against those rules, and then we won't use the rules. But the rules still apply. So it can't be he learned it from here. Option number 3. Ela mehaditnan, haminiach et beito v'halach lishbot be'ir acheret. Echad nechri ve'echad Yisrael oser lebnei chatzerot divrei Rabbi Meir. We're now going to see a number of opinions here, and I charted them out on the sheet, 4 opinions. We learned before, there's 5 people, or it doesn't matter how many people in a chatzer. So what happens? They all have to be part of the Eruv. If one of them isn't part of the Eruv, they mess it up for everybody. What if there were there was a person in the chatzer who leaves for Shabbat, goes away for the weekend. He's not there. Now, he didn't join the Eruv, but he's also not physically present, and there's no one in his house. So the question is, can we say, oh, he's not here, we don't need an Eruv. Right? I'm sorry, we don't need him for the Eruv. We basically can make an Eruv without that person. So then the question is it a Jew or a non-Jew? Why is there a difference? Well, one of the reasons there's a difference is, if it's a Jew, the assumption is a halachic Jew, okay, or a Jew that's not going to travel outside the Tchum on Shabbat, and the person, let's say, went outside the Tchum. So there's no chance they're coming back on Shabbat. But if it's a non-Jewish person, it could be they could come home on Shabbat. So the fact that they're not here now might not allow us, because maybe they'll show up 10 minutes before the end of the day, and then, or they could show up anytime during the day, and then it'll have messed up our opportunity to have done the Eruv. So we're going to see 4 different opinions. Rabbi Meir says, I don't care that they left. Their house is still part of this whole chatzer. They have to be part of the Eruv, whether they're Jew or whether they're a non-Jew. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the fact that we have 4 options, you can figure out what there's going to be 4 permutations here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eino Oseh. He says, they left, they're gone, no problem. You can do whatever you want, right? The assumption is they're not coming back. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Nochri Oser, Yisrael Eino Oser, Mipnei she'ein derech Yisrael lavo b'Shabbat. Rabbi Yossi says what I said before, which is, the Nochri generally might come home on Shabbat, but the Jew's not going to come home on Shabbat. And therefore, if the non-Jew leaves, he still messes it up for everyone. But if the Jew leaves, he doesn't mess it up for anybody. Rabbi Shimon goes even farther, and he says, Afilu hiniach et beito, v'halach lishbot etzel bito ba'otah ha'ir, eno oser shekvar hisiach da'ato. Even if he went to the other side of town, the Jew, and he right, so forget about the non-Jew, but even the Jew, if he went to the other side of town and might come, right, and theoretically could come home halachically, no, the fact that he left indicates that he's not planning to come back on Shabbat, right? He went to his daughters on the other side of town, according to your Rabbi Shimon, and you're allowed. Va'amar Rav Chamer bar Guria Amarav, again, same quote, same people, halacha ke Rabbi Shimon, and again, the same psak, like Rabbi Shimon. Now notice, umam paligale, Rabbi Yehuda, va'amar Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda, and not only that, also Rabbi Yossi. But here they just mentioned Rabbi Yehuda. So again, the Gemara says, "Umay kushya dilma hachanami hecha de itmar itmar hecha de lo itmar lo itmar." Again, they say the same thing. Okay, which is here he says the halacha is like him, and that's why we don't hold by the rule. But if it didn't say halacha was, and we didn't know, we would hold by the rules. And again, you can't prove anything for Rav Sharshia. So option number 4, elamehaditnan v'zeu shamru ha'ani ma'arev beraglav. Rabbi Meir omer ein lanu ela ani. Rabbi Yehuda omer echad ani ve'echad ashir. Says that the ani, since he doesn't have money, what does he do? He can be ma'arev beraglav. He can go stand wherever he wants to be konesh v'tat, be there benesh mashot, and that works. We've learned this already about ma'arev beraglav. Last time we learned it, we didn't specifically learn it was a poor person, but here it says specifically a poor person. So now there's going to be a debate. is it only for poor people or is it for everybody? So Rabbi Meir says, only poor people. Ein lanu ela ani. Only a poor person can be ma'arev b'raglav. Okay, and this basically just means the main eruv is with food, but in the case where you don't have a lot of food to spare, so we don't want you leaving your food there. So we basically allow a poor person who might not have food to put out to do it with his feet, but not a rich person. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, echad ani ve'echad ashir. No, everyone can use their feet to make an eruv, right? And use their body. Lo amru ma'arvim bepat. The whole reason, and this is about which is a better way to do the eruv. Is it more that you're actually standing there and showing this is where I want to be for Shabbat? Or is it more that you put your food out, right? We talked about it before, that food is symbolic and your body is actual, so it actually sounds better. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Lo amru ma'arvim bepat ela lahakel al ashir shelo yetzeh v'yarev b'raglav. It's to help wealthy people so that if they can afford it, so they can do it in an easier manner. We want to make it easy for people to keep the halacha. So we'll make it easier for you to make your eruv. You can go send someone and put some food out. You don't have to actually physically go there yourself. That's if you can afford it. For the poor person, right? He has no choice. The pot's not going to help him. But the point is, right? This is again a difference in approach. According to Rabbi Meir, the main eruv is food. That's the main type of eruv that you make, the symbolic gesture that you're putting your food there. Then maybe he views them even less as symbolic. The fact that your food is there, that's indicative. Whereas just your body is less so than your food. Because the fact that you're standing somewhere doesn't necessarily mean you intend to be there. It's a matter of, did you put food there? Because food is what's important, right? We all know how important, central the role food plays in your household. And I was thinking, my daughter wanted to go somewhere to study, to some empty apartment. And until the food, like it was stocked with food, she didn't really want to be there because, without food, like, what am I going to do there? So it's this idea that food shows I'm being, my place of dwelling is here. So that's the difference in approach. Is it better to do ma'arev raglav or is it better really to have food there? So in any case, the machloket is, can a rich person be ma'arev raglav if they wanted to? So that's the debate between them. Umatnela, and then it says about this, Rav Chia bar Ashi l'Chia bar Rav, kamei de Rav. So Rav Chia bar Ashi brought the following source in front of Chia bar Rav, and he read it like this: Echad ani ve'echad ashir. Right? He said it in the version of Rabbi Yehuda's version, right? That even a rich person. Va'amar and then he said, Rav siyem banami halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. And then he said, and also, and that's, number one, he brought the version of the Mishnah that says, it's a Mishnah, the Mishnah that says according to Rabbi Yehuda. Then he said, and also Rav says halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. So tarte lamali, why did he need to go, right, to say twice, and even once, why did he need to say halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda? Right? Because ha'amar, don't we know Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yehuda halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda? So what do you see from here? The fact that he had to say the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda, and he had to say it with the wording of Rabbi Yehuda, shows that we obviously don't hold by these klalim, because if we held by the klalim, we know already halachas like Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Meir. So again, the Gemara is going to reject and say, Umay kushya, Dilma Rav leit lehane klale. Maybe Rav, who said this, and it's interesting because all the previous ones we quoted by Rav were in the name of Rav, maybe Rav doesn't hold by these klalim. Okay? In other words, it doesn't teach anything that the klalim aren't klalim. And by the way, who did we quote them in the name of? Rabbi Yochanan. And there's another principle, which is kind of funny, because if we say we don't hold by principles, Rav doesn't hold by principles. But there's a concept that if there's, or a klal, a rule, that if Rav and Rabbi Yochanan disagree, we hold like Rabbi Yochanan. And so therefore, if we just put this as Rav, we could say, well, that's Rav doesn't hold by these, but Rabbi Yochanan does, and we hold like Rabbi Yochanan where these klalim exist. So again, Rav Masharshia is knocked out, and I can't learn it from here. So now we're moving on to another source, and a very interesting source, and I'll get in the end to how this is relevant. It's very relevant nowadays in general. We'll see. Elamei haditnan, the following Mishnah. Hayivama lo tachlot v'lo tityabem ad shiula shlosha chodashim. If you're a yivama, that means your husband died, you don't have any children, you have to do yibum or chalitza, you have to wait 3 months to do it. Why do you have to wait 3 months? Okay, it's really for yibum, not for chalitza, but once they said for yibum, they also say for chalitza, which is because we're worried if she marries the next person, then, right, we won't know who the father is, right? Because it could be, remember, pregnancies in those days, they believed either 7 months or 9 months. So if she gets married a month or two later and then has a baby, let's say 2 months later has a baby, And we won't know whether it's a 7-month baby to the new husband or a 9-month baby to the old husband. Okay, so that's going to be a big problem, both for the Yavama and v'shchein shar kol anashim. All women, lo yinasu v'lo yitarsu, not only get married, but also get engaged. Engagement is halachic engagement. We'll get to all this later when we get to Seder Nashim. But in those days, what they would do is they would have Erusin, which we do under the chuppah nowadays. It's the Berkat Erusin. We say it, then we do a break of the ketubah, and then we say the Sheva Brachot. And that's because in those days, they would do it a year before, and that kind of bound them to each other, right? It means basically a woman is kind of permitted to anyone in the world. Once she has Erusin, it's just for that one person. And then once she has Nisuim, that permits her now to her husband. She's not actually technically permitted to her husband, although we'll see. There were certain situations where people did engage in sexual relations while they were engaged. We're going to talk about that soon. But basically, we're going to say they can't get married and they can't even get engaged. And that's because of this concern that maybe once she's dedicated specifically to him, something might happen. And therefore, we don't want any confusion. Varusot yinasu, skip the line, skip 2 lines. Below yitarsu ad shulam shlosha chodashim. They have to wait the 3 months, okay? Anybody. Now we're going to have a list of who this anybody is. Echad betulot, even if they're virgins. Echad beulot, if they're not virgins. Echad almanot, if they're widows. Echad grushot, if they're divorced. Whether they're divorced, widows, any kind of woman has to wait, and this is actually a halacha. You can't remarry within 3 months of being in a previous marriage. Echad arusot ve'echad nesuot, whether you were engaged, okay, even if you were only engaged to the previous person, and then he died or divorced you, they would even get divorced from erusin. Again, we'll get to that also. Ve'echad nesuot, again, just to be clear, erusin is not what we call engagement. When we have engagement is not erusin. We do it under the chuppah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, okay, that's one opinion. So according to the first opinion, none of these women can get married within 3 months. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, nisuot yitarsu va'arusot yinasu. We're not worried about engagement. Nothing happens during engagement. Therefore, if they're married, they can get engaged. If they were married before, if they were engaged and then their husband died or divorced them, then they can get married. Chutz me'arusa shebiYehuda mipnei shelibo gaspa. Dafka in Yehuda was known that often they would sleep together when they were engaged and therefore not in Yehuda. Okay, we'll talk about this minhag. It comes up in Ketubot also. Rabbi Yossi Omer, kol anashim yitarsu chutz min almana mipnei ha'ibul. He says everyone can get engaged, and later we're going to see he's even more permissive. We'll get to that later. Other than the almana, and here's an interesting one, because of ibul, because she should be in mourning for her husband, and therefore we don't allow her to get married within 3 months for that reason. Okay, this is a good question, right? Whether this is true, is it inappropriate for someone to get married within 3 months of their husband dying? Is it, one might say maybe no. Some people say if you have a healthy marriage, then those people get married even quicker, right? But maybe 3 months is short. It's a good question. I'm sure we all know situations where that does happen. In any case, he says you should wait 3 months because of ibul, but to get engaged. Obviously, marriage is something else, but to get engaged, you could get engaged within 3 months other than a widow. Okay, so now that's the source. But now we're going to go further. We now get a story. Rabbi Elazar didn't go into the Beit Midrash. We see many stories like this. He sees Rabbi Asi who's coming out of the Beit Midrash. Right? What did they say today in the Beit Midrash? Says we paskin in this issue like Rabbi Yossi. So then he asks him, are you saying we paskin like him because the Tanakama that disagrees and said across the board, no erusin, no nisuin, right? Nothing is Tanakama, and that must be a dat yachid, because otherwise, why would we paskin like Rabbi Yossi? This, by the way, conflicts with what we saw yesterday. Halachat Rabbi Yossi mechaverav, even if he disagrees with many. But obviously, he didn't think that. So he says, does it mean that the Tanakama is a single opinion? And now we say, yes. 1 second, didn't discuss the issue of 3 months. Let me make sure. Right. So now, didn't Yechida Paligale? So he says, yes, it's true. It's really an individual's opinion. V'hatanya, harei shaita redufa lelech lebeit avia, o shaita lakas im ba'ala, o shaya ba'ala zaken o chole, o shaita hi chola, akara, skena, ktana, ailonit, Okay, let me stop because it's a long line. This whole issue, as we said, is just to ensure that in case she was pregnant with the first husband, right, we want to make sure we know that it was his child and not someone else's child. What's the issue, by the way? There's all sorts of issues that could come up. First of all, mamzerim, right, this child, who's the father of the child, to know who the child's allowed to marry. All sorts of other issues. So, or not just mamzerim, but any arayot, any forbidden relations. So you want to know who the father is. So now they say, what if she ran away and was living in her father's house and she wasn't living with her husband anymore? They had separated, right? Months before the divorce or before he died. Or there was kasim bala. Everyone knew they were not together and they weren't, right? I don't know how everyone knew they weren't sleeping together, but, right, there was a lot of animosity between them. They obviously weren't sleeping together. Okay, these are all situations where it's obvious that she wouldn't have been pregnant from husband number one. O shaya bala zaken, her husband was old. O cholet, or sick. O shaita hi chola, or she was sick, right? The assumption is sick in a way that there's no way she could have gotten pregnant from him, either from him or from herself. Akarav, she was barren, right? She couldn't have children. Skena, she was already postmenopausal. Ktana, she was young. Ilonit, right? She never period yet. Ilonit, she's a woman who, this is already, you're older, but you have no simanim, you don't get your period yet, can't have children. Vishen aru yale later, for some reason she can't have children. O shaya bala chavush bebeit hasurim, or her husband was in jail. Or hamapelet lachar mitap bala, she miscarried after he had died already. Kulan tzrichim lamtin shlosha chodashim divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, what was this brought to prove? This matches Tanakama in the source we saw before in the Mishnah, and therefore, what do we see? That Rabbi Yossi was disagreeing with an individual, which is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi matir le'ares u'menaseh miyad. Rabbi Yossi, though, has a permitting opinion. He says you can do whatever you want in all these situations because, and let's look at the situation. It's only if it's a problem. If it's clear that they weren't together, then obviously she can get married. This whole concern is only about pregnancy. And if it's clear she's not going to get pregnant, or it's clear that she wasn't pregnant from the first husband, then we allow it. Okay, so that's his approach. By the way, where is this relevant today? I'll give you a good relevance from the courts in Israel. So the courts in Israel, as everyone knows, are very careful. They don't accept all sorts of documentation from all sorts of places. So let's say a woman comes in, she wants to get married, she's divorced, and she brings in a divorce document that the Beit Din doesn't accept. They say, oh, this isn't a good enough document. So there have been situations where they'll say, they make her get a new divorce that's going to be according to their standards. And then there have been cases, I know, my husband's involved with this with his working team, which is where they can basically say, they got the court to say, well, we don't want to wait. What happens? First of all, you can only open a tik in the court 90 days before you get married. I think it's 90 days. So now you go, let's say 2 months before, and then they say, oh, well, you have to wait 3 months. You already have a wedding date, you have a hall, you have everything else. Right? And here, she was already divorced. It's just they're making her do this other divorce. So in situations like that, they often rely on, even though they don't really rely on the first divorce document, they rely on it enough to say you don't need the 3 months, even though they don't rely on it to say that, right? And the Aguna cases also, imagine an Aguna gets a divorce, right? She's been waiting for years, and then this halacha kicks in of the 3 months. So the question is are there certain dispensations one can make in certain situations? That's what this is all about. So now they say, umay kushya. So now, wait, I skipped a line. So then they say, right? Vaha mart Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yossi alacha ke Rabbi Yossi, right? And then he says, right? Don't we say the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi? So, 1 second. Right, so the question is, okay, we have to just go back for a minute. Okay, we got lost in these sources. First, we brought the Mishnah. Then we brought the scenario that happened with Rabbi Elazar outside the Beit Midrash. And he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Allah is like Rabbi Yossi. And then he said, what do you mean? Which Rabbi Yossi, right? Does Rabbi Yossi disagree with many or just individual? He says, no, it's just individual. Brings that source to prove it. But the point is, why did he bother saying halacha is like Rabbi Yossi? Don't we know the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi based on these principles? So they say, my kushya dilma afuke midi Rav Nachman amar Shmuel damar halacha ke Rabbi Meir b'gzeirotav. Maybe he didn't want you to be mistaken in this case and think that in this case, Shmuel says the halach is like Rabbi Meir when he makes a gzera. Now, this is really a gzera. What's a gzera? Gzera is when you say, even though theoretically something should be permitted, we're going to forbid it just in case. And this is a clear case like that because clearly this woman wasn't with her husband and she couldn't have been pregnant from him. So therefore, right from the first husband, So therefore, you might have thought we hold like Rabbi Meir here against, right, when we have conflicting principles. Halacha like Rabbi Yossi. On the other hand, halacha like Rabbi Meir when he makes the gzeira, maybe you would hold like Rabbi Meir. That's why he needed to tell you. And again, you can't learn from this to anything else. Okay, next case. Elamei Hadatanya. Now we're moving on to Avodah Zarah issues. This comes up in Masechet Avodah Zarah that when it's their holidays, you don't want to purchase things from them because they'll be all excited that they're doing well and they'll go thank their gods, and you'll be indirectly responsible for Avodah Zarah worship. So idol worship. So Ditanya, you can buy certain things because these things apparently aren't easy to come by, and therefore you're allowed to buy animals, slaves, houses, fields, or vineyards. And you can write them up even in the non-Jewish courts, even though theoretically you shouldn't be beaten. Because if you don't use their courts, right, in the end he might come and say, oh, that wasn't a sale. So you're allowed to do that also. If he was a Kohen and he wanted to do this, if you have some sort of issue with a non-Jew and they call you to their courts in Chutz La'aretz, the Kohen is allowed to go. Normally a Kohen can't go to Chutz La'aretz. It's a fascinating halacha because we know nowadays there's Kohanim all over Chutz La'aretz. But listen to this, it's very interesting. We talked about this, we mentioned it before. Kohen can't go to Chutz La'aretz because it's considered, the rabbis decreed that all of Chutz La'aretz has a chashash of tumah made from a dead person, impurity from a dead person, and therefore Kohanim can't go. However, they allow it if he's in some business problems with a non-Jew. Right, because again, for financial reasons. He can also go to a cemetery. So the Gemara says, Beit HaKvarot? What? A Kohen in a cemetery? You think that? Wait a minute. You can't compare between Eretz HaAmim, which was a Gzeira de Rabbanan, right, a rabbinic ordinance, to Tuma D'Oraita in a cemetery. And the assumption is that here somehow there's a business dealing going on in a cemetery, right? And he needs to go there to hold court with these non-Jews that he's fighting with about something. So they say, Ela bebeit hapras de Rabbanan. Oh no, we meant where it was Suffolk. We've talked about a beit hapras, right? It's a field where there were bones, right? It was plowed, and maybe there's some pieces of bones that are a minimum requisite shear to create tumah, but we don't really know for sure, and therefore that's where we allow him to go into a beit hapras. Okay, if this great source, if he needs to go to Chutz La'aretz to find a wife or to learn Torah, we allow him to go to Chutz La'aretz. Okay, it's another reason why Kohanim can go to Chutz La'aretz. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, here's an interesting debate here. But you can't, if there's yeshivas in Israel, well then stay in Israel, don't go to Chutz La'aretz. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, even if there's yeshivas in Israel, you can still go to Chutz La'aretz Lamod. Why? Not every place of learning is appropriate for every person. Right? We all know this, right? There might be lots of yeshivas, but I might not find my place here. I might need to go somewhere else to find the perfect place for me. And here we even have a case of Yosef HaKohen who went to Tzaidan, right? That's in modern day Lebanon to learn Torah. In fact, we pass on like Rabbi Yossi that we permit going to Chutz La'aretz to learn Torah, even if there's yeshivas here. Again, why does he need to say Alach like Rabbi Yossi? V'ha'amarit, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Alachak Rabbi Yossi. We already know when Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda disagree, we pass on like Rabbi Yossi. So Amar Abai, Itzrich, Salkadat Achamina Hanimili b'matnitin, Aval b'braita emalo. You might have said that's only when it's a Mishnah. But if it's a Braita, which this was, and it's all the other sources we quoted were Mishnayot. But when it's a Braita, why was Braita any different? You might have thought maybe those rules don't apply, because one of the reasons given is that Braitot, often they were recited only orally. They didn't go through this redaction, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he did some editing work. But the Braitot didn't. And therefore, there's a lot of mistakes. We always are switching this opinion, switch that with that, and switch that with that. Sometimes even in Mishnayot we do it, but more in Braitot. And therefore, you can't base a rule on who said what if often it's confused in the Braita, and sometimes they might have quoted the wrong name. And therefore, maybe you would think that. That's why he needs to tell us the halachas like Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so again, we reject this source. Kamashmana. Okay, so that's why you need to say it. we're done. No more proofs for Rav Masharshia. So in the end, they don't really have a proof for why he doesn't hold by these rules. So in the end, they go back to something we said earlier. Elahachi kamar. This is really what he meant. What he meant to say is not, we don't have these klalim at all. What he meant to say is, hane klale lav divrei hakol ninhu. Not everyone agrees that we have these principles. And this goes back to something we saw before. Deharav leitlu lahane klale. Rav himself doesn't hold by these rules. So, and that's what we saw before, that Rav didn't hold by the rules. And therefore, that's what he was coming to tell us. That not everyone agrees. This isn't something that's agreed by everyone. Rav disagrees. And then you don't need to find a source for that, right? We already saw that Rav disagreed about this. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda, right? This was the source about the anima arev b'raglav, right? And then we said, right, Rav taught halacha like Rabbi Yehuda. Why did he need to teach that? And they assumed it must be because Rav didn't hold by these principles. Okay. New sugya. Okay, we started off the Mishnah with going back now to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Cheftze hefkel konim shvita. Remember, do they acquire or do they not? If you leave something in the middle of the street and it's ownerless now, or the water, remember the drinking water, does it have a limit of tchum or not, if it's ownerless? So we said, right, there was a machloket Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the rabbis. Now we're going to talk about what about property that belongs to a non-Jew? Are they konesh shvita or not? It seems weird. The non-Jew himself isn't konesh shvita. The problem is that, right, to me, if the non-Jew can go inside or out of tchum, it has no effect on me. But what about objects that were in the possession of a non-Jew that maybe I'm going to have contact with? Are they bound by the tchum where they were? Because they're kind of like ownerless. They have an owner, but their owner isn't bound by tchum. So the question is, how does this fit in with nichse hefker, or does it not? We'll see. So we're going to see a machloket about it. We're only going to see one opinion. First, we're going to deal with that opinion, and then we'll go back and see the dissenting opinion. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Cheftze nochri ein konim shvita. There's no laws. They're not bound by any sort of tchum. Leman, according to who is Shmuel saying it made? If you're going to say it's according to the rabbis who hold that cheftze hefker ein konim shvita, if ownerless items aren't konim shvita, then obviously items owned by a non-Jew are not going to be, right? So if hashja cheftze hefker deleit lehu balim, ownerless ones ein konim shvita, cheftze anochri deilu balim, and it has owners, and their owners aren't bound by any tchum, mibaya, are you going to ask a question? Of course not. So he basically, what we're saying is, there's no reason to even say this halacha if you're holding like Rabbanan. So it must be, because it's so obvious. Ella aliva to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, must be he's talking about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. V'kamash v'lan, and what's he trying to teach us now? Imor da amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri konim shvita hanemile cheftze hefker deleit lehu balim. Now we're going to say items that are ownerless and have no owner, so those are konesh shvita. Those are going to end up with a space. Aval cheftze anochri deilu balim lo. But things that are owned by a non-Jew, since they have an owner and their owner is not bound by tchum, therefore we're going to say those don't have tchum. But now the Gemara is going to question this. So basically, according to this, both Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and Chachamim would agree that cheftze nochri ein konim shvita. That's going to be a problem because we're going to bring a Tanaitic source that shows that nichse nochri are bound by tchum. And then we're going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense because it doesn't match Chachamim and it doesn't match Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So we're going to have to reject this. Meitive. Rabbi Shimon, so here's the source. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Hashoel klimin anochri b'yom tov. If you borrow a utensil from an ochri on Yom Tov, here are good examples of where this would be relevant. So I go to my non-Jewish neighbor and I borrow something. So now, is that bound by tchum of wherever that, right, by my city, wherever the item was when Yom Tov started? What if I lent my neighbor, my non-Jewish neighbor, I lent them an object, and then hichziro lo b'yom tov, and he returns it to me on Yom Tov. So again, it was within the nochri's possession when Yom Tov started. And any kelim or otzarot or things that were left for a while and were left within the, right, they were within the tchum of the city. These are bound by tchum. Or what if a nochri brings fruits outside the tchum for me? Remember, if he brings them for me, it's a problem because he brought them outside the tchum. Let's say he brought them for everybody on the block and the majority of the block is non-Jewish and then he gave me some. You can't move them from their space because, again, these are things that were brought from out of Tchum, and then you only have 4 amot. So, if you were to say that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which is not what we said before, nichse nochri are konim shvita, then you would say, oh, this source obviously holds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Ela iamar kasav Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri cheftzei anochri ein konim shvita hamane lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'lo Rabbanan. This source basically would end up if you hold nichse nochri aren't konim shvita, even though nichse hefker are konim shvita, then this source doesn't fit with anybody. Now, you have to wonder why they couldn't just say there's a third Tana. But the assumption is if they argue about nichse hefker, this must be a similar machloket. And therefore, they want to connect these two. It can't be that there's some other opinion that we haven't mentioned in some other Tana. So it has to fit into either one of the two. So therefore, it must be that, therefore, okay, and therefore, we have to go back now and reinterpret the statement said in the name of Shmuel, the Cheftzei Nochri Konim Shvita. We can say, I'm sorry, Ein Konim Shvita. We can't say it's according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because from this Braita, it proves that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri must hold Nichse Nochri Konim Shvita, in which case you can't say that that's who Shmuel is holding like. So now we have to go back to the beginning. Lo'olam kasav Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Cheftzei Nochri Konim Shvita. So we're going to assume Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does hold, just like Cheftzei Hefker, also Cheftzei Nochri. They're like ownerless property, which basically takes on the status of wherever they are. Ushmuel da Amar Kerabanan, right? And Shmuel, who says no, must hold like the rabbis who said just like Nechse Hefker aren't Kodim Shvita, also Nechse Nochri. So now they say Udkamarta Rabanan Pshita, but didn't we say, isn't that obvious? So not really, because Ma'u Detema Gzera Balim de Nochri Atu Balim de Israel. You might have thought that maybe we should forbid it. Why should we forbid it? Because ownerless is one thing, but this has an owner. Now, if we say that things that have an owner that are owned by non-Jews aren't bound by Tchum, people might think that items that are owned by Jews aren't bound by Tchum either. Okay, maybe it's a little strange why they would make that jump, but maybe you would think the whole idea of your food and your possessions being bound by Tchum is a strange concept as it is, and maybe people weren't so careful about it, and because of that, they were worried that if we allow their objects, then we might think that people will allow our objects. And therefore, maybe you would think that there's a reason to make a gzera. That's why Shmuel tells us, no, they're not konesh shvita. You don't have to worry about that. But now we get the other opinion. So that was all Shmuel, and then we tried to figure out Shmuel, and again we said Shmuel must hold like the rabbis, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri must disagree. So now we're going to see someone else who passes like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Exactly what we said, maybe you would think, is now because, right? Because maybe we really are concerned for that, he says. And therefore, we're going to forbid it. Okay? And therefore, he says, Cheftzei Nochri are konesh shvita, because they have owners, and therefore, we're going to make a gzera just in case of the Jewish owners, that we might confuse things. Now we're going to have a story. We'll end with the story. There were rams that were brought to the city of Mavarta on Yom Tov, and they were brought from outside the Tchum by non-Jews. If you remember on Yom Tov, it doesn't say Yom Tov here. In fact, some people say it's Shabbat, and then they have a whole problem because how can you be doing business dealings on Shabbat? But if we remember, we learned that for the purposes of Simchat Yom Tov, we allow you to buy meat and things like that as long as you don't pay the money on Yom Tov, but there were ways that it was allowed to actually purchase things. So these non-Jews brought these rams to Mavarta. Rava allowed the people of his city of Mechoza to buy from them. Now, this is strange. They were brought from outside the Tchum, right? If they have Shvita, right, then they're brought from outside the Tchum. What's the problem? Anything brought from outside the Tchum, ein lo ela arba amot. So how could you take it to another city? So Amalei Ravina l'Rava, my da'atech. What are you thinking? Is it because the Amar of Yudah Amar Shmuel Cheftzei Nochri Ein Konim Shvita? Is it because you hold like Shmuel that these chafatzim aren't konesh shvita? If they're not konesh shvita, then obviously it doesn't really matter. You can move them anywhere you want, and then you can take it to your city. Is that why? But if you want to say that, v'ha Shmuel v'Rabbi Yochanan halachak Rabbi Yochanan. But we know that when there's a debate, now here we're bringing these principles again. Debate between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, we always paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. So, and Rabbi Yochanan said, Ein konim shvita. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yochanan said, konim shvita. Okay, so, right, that was the second opinion we brought. So, if Rabbi Yochanan holds konim shvita, how can you allow them to take it to mechoza? Here we're going to read it. He says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, right? He makes this, he instituted this as a gzera so that Jewish possessions, we don't end up confusing and thinking that you can carry them anywhere you want. So, Hadar Amar Rava changes his mind after he's questioned by this, and he says, Lizivnu livnei mevarachta, tekula mevarachta lidiju ka'arba amot amya. He says, okay, fine. I'm not going to allow it for my own city, but you can buy in this city, even though theoretically they were brought from outside the Tchum and they only have 4 amot. But what do we hold? Who do we hold like? Going all the way back? Rabban Gamliel. What did Rabban Gamliel say? If you're put in a dir v'sahar or a sfina, remember, and you leave the Tchum, you get all the, right? It's in a mechitza, it's walled in. You get to walk, that whole area is like your 4 amot. So since these rams were brought into the city, and the city presumably had walls, or at least was defined as one whole unit, we view, you can basically walk around the entire city, and that's why you can bring these rams, okay, here the issue isn't walking around, it's the rams that were brought by these non-Jews can be used in the entire city, but I'm not going to allow it now to go back to Mechoza, because I see now we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that Nichse Nochri are Konim Shvita, because of this Gzera. By the way, it seems like it's not because of Rabbi Yochanan Menuri. It seems like what he's saying is it's because of the rabbis who hold, and that was what Shmuel said. No, they don't hold by that Gzera, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, they are Gozer, and they say even though ownerless possessions aren't Konim Shvita, but since possessions owned by a Jew are, we're going to also forbid possessions owned by a non-Jew so that people don't confuse things. That's where we're going to end today. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll pick up tomorrow or the next year, or you can, it'll be up, by the way, very soon. I pre-recorded it, so I'm going to put it up after class. Have a good day.